Hello, everyone. Can you hear me at the back? Thumbs up. Okay, great. Excellent, excellent. And I apologize if I create more reverb. I'd have to stop doing that, apparently. Thank you all for being here tonight for the launch of the very first issue of The Breakdown. We're very excited to have you all here and very excited to have our illustrious guests, Quinn and Geoff. So this is a live episode recording. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Adrienne Buller and the host and editor of The Breakdown and The Breakdown itself. If you don't know what it is, a bit random that you're here, but fair play. It started out as a sort of podcast and online publication last year focused on questions about capitalism and how it both structures and is being sort of remade by climate and ecological crisis. And this is, as I said, the launch of our very first print issue, Right Turn, which focuses on the prospects for sort of climate politics and climate action in the context of an increasingly authoritarian political climate. I just want to start off by saying a few quick thank yous to everyone who made tonight possible. First off, thank you to Connor and the Art House for hosting us at your lovely venue tonight. Thank you to Commonwealth, who have hosted this project from its earliest days, including many of your sort of team members who've been involved getting it off the ground, to Penelope Gardica, who designed the cover of the issue and the whole book. Thank you very much. In a remarkably short time span, so thank you again to Penelope. Thank you to Dan, who runs our digital, and last but not least to John Merrick, who took a real leap of faith in leaving a decade of publishing at Verso Books to join me on this kind of brand new, silly little venture. So yes, tonight we are exploring the politics of the far right in the context of the climate crisis, and I would like to welcome Quinn Slobodian. Round of applause for Quinn, everybody. Quinn is an acclaimed historian and author of several excellent books, Globalists, Crack Up Capitalism, and sort of tonight's feature book, Hayek's Bastards, The Neoliberal Roots of the Populist Right. And next to him, we have Geoff Mann, also a celebrated author. Round of applause for Geoff. Author both of In the Long Run, We Are All Dead, a sort of history of Keynesianism, as well as Climate Leviathan. And tonight, they are here to share their incredible wisdom and insights with you all. We'll speak for about 45 minutes and leave a bit of time for audience questions at the end, so do think of things that you'd love to ask them. And other than that, we will get underway. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Okay, so to get us started off, Quinn, I'm going to start with you. In your new book, you make, I think, a very compelling case that the many kind of morbid symptoms that we're seeing in Trump, as well as in many of the kind of populist and far-right actors around the world, are not actually kind of a new phenomenon, but instead a continuation with a long history of neoliberalism. So I'd love if you could sort of unpack that argument for us and walk us through really how you understand the very capricious term that is neoliberalism and the kind of turn that it's taking in the present context.
Yeah, thank you, first of all, to Adrienne and everyone. Woo, that's hot. And everyone for coming out tonight. The Commonwealth strikes back. I always love to be in London amongst what one person semi-cynically, semi-admiringly called the embers of the Corbynite left. So I always feel warm in this environment. So the book that I just published, Hayek's Bastards, looks at this surprising riddle or surprise to me that I needed to figure out, which was that many of the people who were part of the movement that had helped construct a pretty optimally functioning, from their point of view, framework for stabilizing and accelerating global capitalism going into the post-Cold War era, suddenly decided that the global order was their enemy and they needed to somehow help dismantling it, and made allies with a set of projects from ethno-nationalism to scientific racism to nativism, and even in extreme forms, hard money, gold bug type fundamentalists, believers in the need to return to the shiny metal that underpins all value. So why did the neoliberals kind of lose their mind? How did they end up in the camp of people who seem like they're enemies on the face of it, the nationalists, the economic protectionists, and so on. This was something I've been trying to figure out since 2016, 17, when I was dissatisfied with the narrative that we had just seen a revolt from the countryside, a kind of cry of anguish from the left behinds that led to Brexit and Trump. Rather, it looked like a lot of the people on the supply side who were sort of stage managing a lot of that were out of the neoliberal camp. So like, what the hell happened? Where did that come from? There's, of course, many things I could say about that. It's the subject of the whole book, but I think I'll narrow it down to the question of the climate for the purposes of this conversation, especially because it was one of the, I would say, kind of research or archival discoveries that surprised me, which was the moment that the Soviet Union collapsed and the Berlin Wall had fallen. The people who had been advocating for economic freedom and international division of labor for decades were not in a particularly good mood and had, for some reason, decided that maybe they had actually lost the Cold War. The reason they thought they'd lost the Cold War is they thought the enemy had changed its shape and its color. So it was no longer state socialism or communism, but now it was the gay rights movement, the women's movement. It was the push for civil rights and affirmative action. And in particular, almost most emphatically, it was the environmental movement. So this notion that the enemy had changed from red to green was surprisingly recurrent in the early 1990s. And of course now follows through the decades that followed. So there was a couple things that seem important to me there. One is they saw the potentially disruptive nature of movements to address, ecological destruction and global warming, and took it quite seriously quite early. They didn't see it as absorbable within a capitalist logic at that time, nor actually did they later. So in the era that many of us were, deeply engaged with at different levels of green capitalism and a just energy transition sort of managed within the framework of capitalism, there were these dissidents who from the beginning believed that that couldn't work and that it was a slippery slope, and that the moment you start to try to absorb and internalize questions of climate into the functioning of capitalism, you are setting a trap for yourself that will eventually end in the dismantlement of the system of accumulation as you know it. So that's what, I'll just leave it at that for the purposes of this, is that one of the things that led them to these strange alliances with the far right was their feeling that the centrists, the Mark Carneys of the world, although to the outsider might look like neoliberals in the purest form, were actually accidentally betraying the true cause and being co-opted by leftists in a way that would lead to the eventual, collapse of the capitalist project. So they needed to stake out further positions to the right to keep at bay the chances of a gradualist slippery slope around the language of climate. So a lot of the mutations I describe are them addressing what they see as what Nancy Fraser would call progressive neoliberalism, which for them was never the highest form of neoliberalism, but was always a tainted alliance that might ultimately actually lead to the corruption of the project of protecting economic freedom and the rights of capital.
And Geoff, I'd love if you could actually pick up on that a little bit. And 10 points for mentioning Mark Carney. I would like you to try and work him into each answer this evening.
Definitely.
So if you could just pick up on something Quinn was talking about there a little bit about the kind of co-opting by progressive forces of neoliberalism, and maybe put in context for us something that a few contributors explore in the issue, which is how the question of kind of Bidenomics and the Inflation Reduction Act, this kind of massive industrial policy program, but also with a kind of climate tint, kind of fits into this as a sort of program that in many ways was seen as both a radical break with anything that had been done on climate in the US before that point, but also somehow incredibly in keeping with all the kind of tenets of sort of liberal economic governance rather, that have sort of paved the way for this more reactionary moment.
Sure, I can definitely give that a go.
Yeah. 2 minutes.
There are a lot of people in the room who are just as well prepared as me, I'm sure. I do think that the upheaval around the analysis that followed the IRA in particular, and Bidenomics more generally, they seem to me the sort of intellectual upheaval on the left, let's say, is an accurate representation of how complicated the actual situation was or is. I do think in some ways one could argue that it paves the way for the kinds of reactionary visions that we're seeing right now, especially perhaps on the climate front, but perhaps more generally. But I do think there's a way in which it follows a logic that, as far as I understand what Quinn has been working on, fits in that logic quite well. I mean, Daniela has done a lot of work on this front, on the de-risking nature of the state on this whole complicated arrangement, let's say. But I would also say that one of the flaws that is telling in the whole IRA Bidenomics frame, I would argue, is the fact that climate itself, and I'm not telling anyone anything they don't know, is often a bit of a sideshow in the whole thing. People have championed it, of course, because we've had so little to celebrate that even the fact that something looked like perhaps it was concerned about climate seemed like a really big deal at the time. But I do think they tied climate to a variety of domestic and geopolitical concerns that in fact ended up marginalizing climate concerns and making it quite easy to sort of dismiss them once the moment had passed. And the extent to which climate was mobilized for basically an anti-China moment, a domestic integration of hopefully a voter base for the Democrats, all of that kind of thing on the American front, put us in a situation where climate, which was already quite minimal and had in fact been intentionally hidden by the whole process for reasons that I think are very close to the arguments that Quinn is making, became less and less crucial to the moment. And so I guess we could argue that it paved the way, but in some ways I might say that there's almost a way in which its implicit invisibility helped enable the process as it moved forward, if this is making any sense at all. And now it's sometimes, I must say, I don't know if people in the room feel this way, but there is a sense in which Bidenomics feels like ancient history already. It's a sort of remarkable moment that we all were in a fluster about, it seems like just months ago. And now, here we are.
Can I say something about that? I mean, not that the New York Times bestseller list is the best barometer of public opinion. It gets, juked and played with by presses in all kinds of ways. But I do think that we are presented with a very interesting binary in the last couple of weeks on that very list, where Alexander Karp's Technological Republic was the #1 book, which basically says, forget about promises of prosperity, forget about promises of growth. Output legitimacy is dead. Never mind democracy, we don't even bother mentioning it. We are in a martial moment. It's a Spartan moment of self-hardening that masculinity basically requires, or else we will be, forever just cucked by I don't know what. That's a very stark and for me, troubling vision of what techno-authoritarianism is supposed to look like. The state doesn't work anymore. Plug our products in now, and we will make the state defend you against the autonomous drone swarms on the horizon. The other option was, the other #1 bestseller is Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson's Abundance, a very blithe and really fundamentally unserious book about permitting reform, which just takes a big old detour around all of the complicated negotiations that the IRA and Bidenomics was. Someone who was closely involved with the Bidenomics program has been unable to sell their book because people aren't interested in complicated things. They just want one-word stories. And in this case of abundance, turns out that's the same term that, as I found out researching for this new book I'm writing about Elon Musk's grandfather, Joshua Haldeman, the first chiropractor in Saskatchewan. Yep.
More Canadian trivia.
Yeah. Was also big in Technocracy Incorporated, which sought to dissolve the entire nation's borders into one technate, actually all the way down to Colombia, interestingly. And if you look in their journal articles from 1943-44, the most common word is abundance. So that's it's almost worse than just growth, right? I mean, it's even shittier as an indeterminate, catchphrase for all that's supposed to be, that's supposed to buy people in with a blissful detachment from the consequences of accumulation. So I agree with what Geoff is saying, is that those halfway conversations, the mixed analysis, the reservations, which were all very justified in the moment of the IRA, now look like the heights of sophistication compared to this really crude binary that's being presented, at least to the American public.
I think a fundamentally unserious book about permitting reform is like the perfect blurb for the. I kind of want to pick up actually a little bit on, I mean, you mentioned him, so we're going to have to do it, which is figures like Elon Musk. And I think what he and others tell us about how the kind of new and far right, however you want to term it, is engaging on climate. I think it's an incredibly inconsistent engagement with environmental and climate issues across the board. You know, one of the contributors to this issue writes about the Sweden Democrats, Lucas, I think he's here, shout out Lucas, and about how they've sort of co-opted climate into their agenda, whereas if you look at the kind of US fixture, it's a completely different sort of state of affairs. And it's easy to forget, you know, that very recently Elon Musk was the kind of darling of the climate world. Again, I'm just giving endless shout outs to the issue, but John Merrick in his contribution writes about how, you know, Time magazine just in 2021 was writing about Elon Musk as the savior of the earth. Kind of, they describe him as square jawed and standing bestride the earth, which is insane, but happened. And so if you could maybe unpack first, Quinn, how can you find any kind of sort of clear through lines and how different kind of actors and parties of the far right are engaging with climate or the environment as an issue? Because to me, it feels incredibly inconsistent and I can't yet work out a kind of grand narrative or theory. Maybe there isn't one. And maybe, Geoff, on that same point, you know, in your book, Climate Leviathan, you sort of sketch various different kind of climate futures, all relatively worrying. And if maybe, you know, where we stand now fits into any of those quadrants, if you could unpack them for us and how you kind of understand that engagement.
I mean, there's the old Merchants of Doubt story, which is the kind of Fred Smith Competitive Enterprise Institute denialist stuff, which is where this starts. If you look at the 80s, 90s stuff, it's like gatherings of the Mont Pelerin Society in which someone says, and who knows, maybe it's just kelp beds and sunspots. We don't even know what's going on for real. It might not be people at all. So there's that story. And then there's the more recent story of the kind that, you know, Kate Aronoff writes about and Overheated, which is like, maybe the new denialism is just saying like, don't worry, we're doing some mitigation at the margins. And so it's a kind of lip service that actually does nothing to confront the actual breadth of the challenge. But then there's, I think, the green capitalist moment where to plug into an attention to climate becomes an underexplored market niche. And this is, you know, in part what our great scholar of this moment, Daniela Gabor here in the front row, has written so well about the way that the Larry Finks of the world will set their sails to the wind of that particular direction insofar as it's helpful for them. And whether or not they're sincere, air quotes, is kind of beside the point. It's a market and it's an angle and it's a new source of revenue. So let's go. And Musk falls into that category too, I think, in ways that have not been really appreciated, right? I mean, his interest in Tesla and electric vehicles, I think, was mostly just a canny observer of consumer demand. And it, you know, his project began with SpaceX before it was Tesla. And SpaceX, you know, nothing uses up fuel like rockets. And there was never any sort of hesitation there because the overall project was much larger, which is build a multiplanetary civilization. And that's going to take a lot of carbon. But hey, guess what? We'll be on the rocket like when things really go to hell. So there's no attention to the collective well-being of the species as such as like a North Star towards which politics or certainly a business model should be oriented. And I think the fact that he saw EVs as a growth market just kind of duped a bunch of people for a while into thinking that that was something he actually cared about. Even something like the Powerwall, which is you know, a really useful form of energy storage that people install in their homes in places. For example, my friend's home in Puerto Rico, they rely on it with an inconsistent power grid. But I see that also as less like clean tech and more like catastrophe tech. I mean, it's partially the outcome of growing up in a place like South Africa where you're like, oh, we can't trust infrastructure. We need to figure out autonomous ways of, you know, provisioning ourselves when things go to hell. And I guess that's sort of green, but not really, right? It's more like taking seriously the fact of limits and the fact of incipient breakdown. And then planning for that. So like if you put solar panels on your house because you believe that the energy grid is run by corrupt bureaucrats and will eventually fail, are you an environmentalist? I mean, I guess that's an open question, but I think he tends more to the survivalist than someone who's trying to think through large-scale categories and frameworks for collective care.
So I hope I'm not just speaking for myself when I say this and that other people in the room are thinking this. But when we hear something like Elon Musk saying multi-planetary civilization, like, I think he's fucking bonkers. Everyone thinks that, I'm sure. But I also can't believe he really thinks that, if that makes sense. Is there anything, am I being naive? Is this there's something about this moment and the extreme claims from so many that seem barely even conceivable, let alone believable. So a figure like Musk is hard to place in the framework that Joel and I wrote or created in Climate Leviathan. Not that we need to fit individuals in any particular space, but for the purposes of our conversation here, I think that the most relevant kind of framings that we lay out there, which both have their limits, are what we call Climate Leviathan and Climate Behemoth. And there is a sense, when we wrote the book, which we finished just before the election in 2016, we actually had, as a sort of caricature in our mind of Climate Behemoth, Sarah Palin, not Donald Trump. And the idea of Climate Behemoth was, it was a reactionary nationalist, arguably always ethno-nationalist, certainly always macho or masculinist, as I said, reaction to the climate moment, and a kind of refusal that might involve denialism, which we didn't in fact think could last. I mean, and I actually think we're already approaching a point where denialism is not a position that people can hold very strongly anymore. But it was a vision of an international climate politics where nations turned in on themselves. And Trump has, of course, personified this in a way that has made us seem much more prescient than we actually were. So people have said, oh, not that everyone would say this, but some people have said, oh, you predicted Donald Trump. It's like, no, we did not. We didn't even come close to predicting Donald Trump, because Donald Trump is worse, actually, than what we imagined. And also because anyone could have predicted this kind of reaction on the part of the American right. But what Climate Behemoth is interesting to us for, at least, is its opposition to what we thought, and still think, if I'm honest, is the more likely outcome of a global climate politics, which is the mobilization of existing elites, nation states in some cases, institutions, resources, etc., to confront climate change. It will never be adequate to actually addressing the problem, but to confront climate change in a way that maintains existing hierarchies, so that the people on top stay on top, which will require dealing with climate change in some form or another. It's not possible, for us at least, to imagine a world in which meaningful climate action is not undertaken just to maintain the nature of the hierarchy upon which so many of these people depend. And someone like Musk, who is certainly not exemplary of any particular type as far as I understand it, doesn't fit, partly because we imagined, I guess in some ways, something like an ideological commitment on the part of actors inside those blocks. It doesn't sound like that's exactly what's driving him. And so he's kind of flipped between being the symbol of Climate Leviathan, the rise of green capital, the rise of something like, without the social dimensions of it, a kind of progressive attack on climate, to exemplifying in some ways many of the features of what we thought was Behemoth, especially on a whole bunch of other fronts. And so he doesn't fit, which is actually, I'm not even sure it's a problem with the framework, which has its own problems. But this is how we understood things. And I think if Joel were here beside me, sorry, I should have said that all of this, I should have said this right at the beginning, that all of what I'm saying is based on work I did with my friend, my very good friend and co-author, Joel Wainwright, in a book that we call Climate Leviathan. And everything I'm saying right now, especially the smart parts, come from Joel. And I wish he were here beside me. He's extremely articulate, and it would be wonderful to have him with me. But I think Joel,
He's not Canadian, though.
he's not Canadian. He
So,
right now
wouldn't
he is
work.
desperately wishing he was Canadian. I will tell you. But so all of this work is based on work with Joel, certainly not my own. And this is the framework that we posited as a way to understand the current moment. And I still think it matters, even if the edges are much more fluid than we might have understood.
But is it possible that you wouldn't have predicted that there would be such parity of public and private power? Like, it seemed like in your book, it was about ultimately state actors, state representatives were the ones who were the main actors, protagonists. And yet this kind of co-presidency that Musk enjoyed for the last 100 days is almost like would have seemed outrageous to foresee.
We never foresaw anything like this. And though I would say that one of the things that's emerged over time, I think that both Joel and I would take more seriously now, is the idea. We imagine climate leviathan coalescing in some form of global governance, not necessarily like a global government, but global governance, one that took seriously managing the climate for the planet. And it seems to me now that to the extent that there are emergent climate leviathans, they are plural. They are various nation states, they are other kinds of coordinated mechanisms, they are various kinds of institutions that are not necessarily urged toward the global. I think partly because no one wants to set the precedent of global governance. Anyway, this is where we're at. Beg your pardon?
It's a tarnished brand.
It's a tarnished brand. Yes, exactly. Anyway, I hope that gets somewhere toward.
Very much so. I think actually listening to both of you, I want to take a slight step back. And clearly what we're dealing with is something radically new and very strange, if not bizarre. But I think, if you read any kind of newspaper headline, you scroll through any kind of liberal centrist social media, even our own social media, a lot is being made of comparisons to sort of the 1930s is kind of constantly invoked as reflecting the moment that we're in. Lots of people talking about fascisms, both real and incipient and present and historic. And both of you in some ways are actually historians of the 1930s, you sort of Keynesianism and yourself neoliberalism. So I'd love actually if you could both tell us, I guess, what you make of that kind of invocation of this previous era. Do you think it's a distraction? Do you think it's useful? Does it kind of tell us anything? And if so, what?
Yeah, I mean, one of the really interesting things about the way that Geoff talked about Keynes in The Long Run We're All Dead and the way that neoliberals talked in the 1930s is that I think I really appreciated the way you highlighted the similarities between like a Hayek and a Keynes, often assumed to be opponents. The Hayek versus Keynes frame was very popular for a little while there. But your point was that they were both counter-revolutionaries and of a different flavor, that Keynes saw a certain way of defanging the potentiality of democracy in one way, and the Hayekians saw it happening in another way. But both were forms of institutional fixes, I would say. It's for the Hayekian neoliberals, it was like a question of like statecraft and lawcraft at some level, and it was more of a policy and economic question for the Keynesians. But I think that I find the parallels between then and now to be not particularly helpful. And the one reason I would usually trot out for why I don't find them helpful, I feel like I'm now on shakier ground, because that was the idea that quote unquote nobody, and I feel like I could say this with confidence from 2016 until quite recently, was actually trying to withdraw behind high tariff walls in permanence for the reconstruction of some kind of regional autarky, let alone national autarky. I now think, and well, sort of know, that within the US MAGA coalition, there are people who do want that. So I think that Peter Navarro, by his strange NIMBYist degrowth, Garrett Hardin sort of Sierra Club backdoor, actually thinks that we can do in the United States like degrowth autarky. I don't think he's right, but I think that that's now on the agenda in a way that I thought was always, like a liberal nightmare, or like a nightmare of an FT columnist, Alan Beatty or whatever, like just having this, waking up in a cold sweat and be like, they want autarky. Like, no, they don't. Nobody wants autarky. But I think now maybe, oh my God, some people maybe do want autarky. So that opening to we're back to the 1930s is realer now, 100% realer now than it was 5 years ago, 6 years ago. Trump 2 brings back the specter of the 1930s in economic policy in a serious way that I don't think was ever there in Trump 1. But as far as the models of what extreme right-wing politics should look like, I mean, I've written recently about Saudi Arabia as an important model for Trump. After I published the article, someone told me about how Eric Trump was at the launch of the Jeddah Tower, Trump Tower, and in the course of his remarks said, no country in the world has been better to us than this country, Saudi Arabia. And he said, it's a story of two families intertwined, the House of Saud and the House of Trump. And that's very interesting for a bunch of reasons, but like the dynastic, extractivist model that is, yes, diversifying its economy internally, but not because it wants to unplug from the global economy, but because it wants to stabilize its edge in the global economy and prepare for, the stranded asset future that may be not so far in the future. Seems to me a way of balancing out global dependency and national self-strengthening in a way that doesn't fit well into the binaries of, Cordell Hull's liberal internationalism or Hjalmar Schacht's like Großraum thinking or whatever, and producing like a regional autarky. So I think thinking between those is quite helpful, and actually Gulf countries, I think, model that in ways that is still instructive for what's the North Star for sometimes the UK Tories and sometimes the GOP.
Sorry, I turned it off every time. I think less, perhaps I should think more, about the relationship. Yeah, and just leave it at that. That's where it is. About the parallels between the 30s and now, except specifically to do with the recruitment of the term fascism, which, at least in the communities that I run in, probably the ones that people in the room do too, has a sort of complicated valence and draws very strong reactions from some folks who feel very strongly that we need to mobilize the term in a very precise way, that this moment is not the same as the 30s, Mussolini, Franco, Hitler, these kinds of things, and that we lose analytical purchase by throwing it around so much, because we do, perhaps you don't, but I do, throw it around a fair bit. I am not sure how this relates to what Quinn has just said, but I at least feel quite strongly that the policing of the word fascism, as if we shouldn't be raising it now, is very problematic. I think it's important to talk about what parallels there are. It's important to identify the gaps between the two moments, but it's very important, it seems to me, to be ringing alarm bells, if nothing else, to be talking about the problem as if it is real, to be looking at the historical experience of those who in the 1930s said the very same thing. We can't name this yet. And then they're knocking on your door. I do think that the search for, there's something about rigor right now in the analysis of the left that I find not very productive. I think I want looser, more open, creative, generous conversations that allow for people to move more freely to try to make sense of this moment, because it's clear to me, it seems, the categories that we have continually mobilized over the last several decades are losing purchase, and we need new ones. And we're only going to do that by experiment, by to some degree losing an attachment to rigor or precision, and to allow ourselves to be unclear in a moment that is extraordinarily unclear, if that makes any sense. That we need concepts that are true to the world we live in, and the world we live in is not precise or clear, it seems to me. And so I worry about the policing by someone like Corey Robin, whose work I really much admire, denouncing the use of fascism at every moment when it's not historically accurate. I'm not worried about accuracy right now. And I don't think it is what mobilizes political movements, is accuracy or rigor.
I was going to mention another experience that I had in the classroom. teaching a class this semester on the far right in Europe. And the first 3/4 of the class were dominated by this question of how one defines discourse that is like beyond the space of legitimate democratic discussion. And it's, as we know, especially in Germany, a very political question whether a party is considered radical right or extreme right. Radical right can be permitted to exist. Extreme right means you're prohibited, and it becomes illegal to have those symbols of that party, to be in running in elections, or to be a member. And so a lot of it was, a lot of the literature about this from the early 2000s is like, we're troubled by the rise of the right. How far can it go? What is extreme? What is radical, et cetera? And someone in the class is a Polish lawyer, and he was auditing the class, he was a bit older, and he was kind of like smiling bemusedly to himself throughout this discussion. And at some point he just said, like, you know what's so funny about this is that you're all assuming that you're getting to decide. You know, that you are inside the castle, so to speak, saying like, who may be permitted in? What sort of discourse is allowable here? Where he's like, you know, I'm in Poland, we're on the outside. Like, they are in the castle, they're running it. They have the universities, they have the archives, they have the museums, they have the cultural institutions, they have the newspapers, they have the government, till recently, but still, you know, the meta-politics that the far right has been running in places like Hungary and Poland has succeeded, and they have gutted civil society and taken it over for themselves. And so now they have decided, we don't care about your doctrinal disputes. Like, we don't care if you think this or that or the other thing. Like, you don't have a place to speak anyway. You don't have a show anymore. You don't have a concert anymore. You don't have a newspaper anymore. You don't have a university anymore.
Yeah, I think what's incredibly clear to anyone living through this moment is this kind of erosion of any sense that we may have had of a democracy and kind of democratic legitimacy, and particularly in the US, not just in the classroom, but obviously the kind of policing and repression and deportation of students and activists, and a kind of real crackdown on any kinds of freedoms. It's very obvious. But I think what I find interesting is that both of you, in your sort of historical studies of these other kind of isms that we talk about, so both neoliberalism and sort of Keynesianism, which has sort of reigned in many ways, sort of some combination of those two, you describe them both separately as anti-democratic in some ways. So neoliberalism as an effort to insulate the market from demands for kind of more democratic redistribution, and sort of Keynesianism as kind of anti-democratic in its sort of approach to sort of crisis management and sort of putting down those same demands. And so, you know, my question, I guess, and it'll be my final question, then we'll open it to the audience, is sort of twofold. So one, you know, is there any kind of political movement or ism for democracy? Have we ever kind of experienced that? If all combinations of these things have sort of operated to sort of quell those demands, and is, you know, in this kind of crumbling moment, is more democracy, better democracy, some kind of version of it, the answer? Or, you know, is that impossible? Do we need to be thinking and turning towards, I don't know, something else?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the status of democracy in the narrow world that I study is interesting because it changes its form, right? So democracy that the first generation of Hayekian types were worried about was a kind of a code word for socialist revolution, right? And this is probably true. This was true for Keynes too. Like, if you actually give people a full control politically of the future of the country, then they will vote to expropriate the wealthy, you know, treat the state as loot or booty to be redistributed amongst their comrades, and, you know, the whole mechanism will smash and break. The long arc of the 20th century, from 1930s to the 1990s and 2000s, which the last 3 books I've written has kind of walked through, ends with the moment of the 1990s when Murray Rothbard, the anarcho-capitalist, basically says, hold on a sec, why are we still doing Hayekian politics? And he says this literally. Hayek wanted trickle-down politics. You persuade the elites. He was still in Viennese coffeehouse mode. You know, you win over the journalists and the politicians, and then you figure out a way to basically tie the hands of the sovereign in a way that they won't be seduced by popular demands. So you will, you know, constrain the democracy by constraining the lawmakers. And that's what, you know, the budget rule in the European Union, constitutional balanced budget amendments, things like that were all versions of this. Like, the people tend socialist, so let's keep the people somehow in check. What Rothbard realizes by the 90s is like, oh no, the the people are not socialist anymore, not in the United States anyway. They are much more governed by social Darwinist logics of like individual gain and like intercommunal conflict. And they're not going to, if given the chance, vote for socialism. In fact, the only socialists left are the elites. They're in the Ivy Leagues, they're in Washington, they're in Brussels, they're in Geneva, and they are still able to indulge in this fantasy, this 1930s fantasy of global governance, which now has had such a tarnished reputation. So what he says is we need to use the popular anger. He calls it a revolution of white Euro males. He also called it the outreach to the redneck strategy. Not because he wanted to create a redneck republic after the day after, but because he wanted to use the popular anger to destroy the current settlement and to smash up the current set of status quo arrangements, which had entrenched a large state as they saw it, far beyond its correct size. And then afterwards, we would build something new in the ruins. So there was a kind of embrace of popular energy that has led them to the kind of alliances they did. I mean, I begin the book with Antonio Martino, who's an economist, an Italian economist, who then helps found Forza Italia like the next year with Silvio Berlusconi. Why is this rational economist working with this like clownish media figure who's like ginning up like nationalist sentiment? Why? Because he thought that it could use it as a battering ram against the Social Democrats who he thought ran the European Union. So that instrumental use of democratic energies is something that market radicals have become quite good at, while others have looked on in horror, of course, like the never Trumpers exist alongside the Trumpers, obviously. But I don't think that means that democracy has lost its power or its force. I don't think that can happen, actually, because I think all that means is how do you, pool and create terrains of common investment and interest amongst people who are different, and then create politics out of that. And like, how is that not just an evergreen, spring of imaginative energy? I think it's just that is a self-perpetuating machine that we have actually in societies. And the inattention to that, or the seeing it as a threat or something to be instrumentalized, or in the case of the Alexander Karp vision, to just act like it's no longer something you even need to give lip service to, is, arguably a great opening for the left. I honestly think if their greatest thought leader says you need to just do Starship Troopers to like keep the autonomous drones at bay, then there's a good way to say this is not responding to the people's will at all. Like, we have something better that we have come up with ourselves. So I don't see any reason to be gloomy about the payload that democracy still has as an idea.
I'm a little bit less hopeful. Not because I disagree with anything Quinn has said, actually, but I think, thinking specifically from a climate perspective, I do think that there is a not very well suppressed anti-democratic urge in much of the climate movement. The fear being that if we let people do what they want to do, we'll be much worse off. And so that expresses itself both in a technocracy, or a technocratic urge, but also in a very anti-populist urge that I think is very real and very meaningful, and will only get more meaningful even inside the self-identified left over the next while. So I am concerned for the prospects of democracy, while also agreeing with Quinn that doesn't demerit or in any way besmirch democracy itself. But I do think there's a who's afraid of democracy question that will be posed over and over more frequently in the years that come. That worries me, of course, just like it probably worries everybody else in the room, and my guess. I see, if I see this resolving itself in meaningful ways, I often see it as being resolved at a scalar level in some senses. I do think that if climate change unfolds in the ways that climate science says it will, that we will see an increasing importance of what we now might call local or regional political movements. We might or might not call those movements governance. And they will be increasingly important and make possible what we might call democracy at that moment, much more probable than the existing nation state does, which I don't, if I'm honest, see persisting in the long run. We're all dead.
What about climate Mao? Any prospects for that?
Again, I think it's a regional response, just like we tried to argue in the book. It's a very loosey-goosey part of the book, which is, there's good and bad to that, probably a lot of bad. But I do think that's a specific response that we anticipate in Asia, which has, as you probably know, a huge proportion, more than half of the people considered greatly at risk of extreme climate events live in Asia, and the political traditions there will be different than they are here. But I do really believe that we're looking at a scalar shift over time.
Great. Okay, well, neither of you gave like a hopeful opportunity there, but I'm out of time to make you do that. So I'm going to turn over to audience questions. Can anyone just give me a very quick time check? And yes, Darius, I will come to you. You stood up so swiftly. 8:05. Perfect. Okay, I think we got space for two. So Darius, and then I'll take any. Yeah, okay, Danielle, you know them too well. Yeah, one else at the front, and then maybe I'll take three. So yes, you in the white shirt, and then yes, you there. Yes, you. Yeah, thumbs up. Perfect. Okay, start with Darius. Yeah, actually, I will come. I'll. No, but it's a live podcast recording, Geoff. So I'll bring this over to you.
I'll go on the way.
Oh, you've got another one? Okay, perfect. I'll deliver to the front.
Thank you. So this is a question about the sort of emotional vehemence or affective force of the anti-climate sentiment among the MAGA folks, especially. Back in the 1980s, good old Maggie Thatcher was concerned about climate change. George Bush Sr. said that, what did he say? That the greenhouse effect will be addressed by the White House effect. Mm-hmm. It was not yet coded as a strong right-left issue. And I always thought that this is just the merchants of doubt effect, that the fossil fuel industry just invested massively in mimetic warfare to turn it into a polarized issue. But you're suggesting, I think, Quinn, also interested in Geoff's view on this, that turn has deeper ideological roots. So is it just manipulation, or is there a deeper ideological story? That's my question.
Great. And could you hand it to the lovely person just next to you there? And we'll take all three, and then we'll take the answers just for logistical ease.
My question was, how do you, whether you had any thoughts on how you overcome the fragmentation of the left? So I think you could argue that a lot of people would agree that there's more that needs to be done to address climate change, or that the status quo of politics isn't working. So I think polls in the UK show that like a lot of people would prioritize doing more to address climate change, or even the local elections that happened last Thursday, like the response in terms of Reform's popularity seems to be more of a rejection of the fact that people don't feel represented by the politics of the current day and age. And I feel like you touched on it with your conversation about the policing of the use of the word fascism. But how do you create more cohesion and unity on the left, especially in the face of growing right-wing movements that seem to enjoy the sense of emphatic unity?
Thank you. And then I'll just hand this over to you.
Cheers. Thank you. You've spoken a lot about the right, understandably, and about Trump, again, understandably. But we're not in America. We're in London, and that's in England, unfortunately. And we have Keir Starmer. So I guess my question is about, where do the liberals and the centrists fit into this? Not just the sort of, how did they help produce this moment? I think we all know about the handmaidens of fascism, if we're allowed to use the word. But how are they changed by this moment? Where do they fit?
Thank you. 3 excellent questions. Answer as you will.
Okay, so I guess I'll move backwards. I mean, everyone in this room knows more about UK politics than me, so I'm not going to act like a jackass by trying to tell you about UK politics. So I guess that in that sense, just trying to stay in my lane. As far as what I think the unifying model could be, and this also links to Darius's question about whether or not there's a deeper story here. The interesting thing about the Bidenomics moment, and perhaps maybe this does help explain the kind of liberal reformist conundrum, is, and maybe the reason why it gets memory hold in favor of just something called abundance, is there was a very serious attempt to think through all of the scales that we have been discussing here. How do you use the momentum of things like the Sunrise Movement and people's interest in at a a youth grassroots level? How do you link that to creating a virtuous cycle of people who have been, left out by projects of deindustrialization, who feel like they have been forced into precarious labor? So how do you build in care economy, well-paid, union-friendly jobs in red states in particular, because that's where most of the IRA funding was going, in a way that can also crowd in capital, doing all of the de-risking stuff that makes it economically sensible for companies to even come from other parts of the world to do their construction projects and turbine technology and solar panels or whatever it is in the United States. And then how do you make that all happen while facing opposition within your own party who wants you to be constantly halving the amount of subsidies and money you're spending on this in a short enough time frame that it shows results in people's everyday lives before the next midterms or the next election? It's extremely hard. If you're trying to do anything approaching like the Green New Deal, as someone who worked in Catherine Tai's U.S. Trade Representative office said to me, she said, FDR had 3 terms. It's kind of like as simple as that. Like they needed more time to make what was, I've been in this situation before and like, why the fuck am I doing this? But like simping for like Bidenomics. But like it was a serious attempt at different levels to confront the complicated machinery that we've been describing. It was filled with problems and blind spots, etc. But, I think it was trying to do liberal reformism and bringing constituencies together in the kind that was just queried about from the audience. The opposition was very mobilized for sure. And you need look no further than the UK backyard to see how quickly things that are very innocuous can become scandalized. So I was talking about this class on the European far right I taught this semester. One of my favorite handouts was from the guy from Right Said Fred, who led the anti-15-minute cities movement in Oxford. That was a half page that just said on the front, "Hello, guinea pig," and then proceeded to explain why the 15-minute city model was like being rolled out from above. It was part of like a model of pandemic passports and climate passports and credits, and soon your property would be expropriated and you would be forced to live within a very constrained territory and never be able to accumulate any savings again. And it's like insane. Like, for sure it's insane. Like, how do you jump from such a chill, like walkable city initiative to like a global conspiracy to end private property? So they are absolutely not stopping by just turning on the bazookas every time they see any, half step towards mitigation or reform or just even like livability. So you can't discount that. And the Zetkin Collective, I think, has been doing an incredible job collecting this stuff. The Great Driving Right show that they wrote for Salvage is a wonderful piece, and they have one in the breakdown. But I think that's where the right, the neoliberal right in particular, was thinking about scalar governance. So why were they concerned with green policy in 1991? Well, because they thought that the European Union, the nascent European Union, was going to be acting as a Trojan horse for environmental regulations that could sit on top of the nation, which, by the way, is what they had been hoping that global economic governance would do for 70 years, except to protect property rights and the investor predictability and capital security. But now, rightfully, they're like, oh my God, this is a really powerful apparatus. Like, what happens if this apparatus gets hijacked and used for another purposes? So they were that's the way they were thinking about it, I think, not just so much like how will we be able to drill as much as we want to, but what if humanity is evolving in such a way that it's developing new ways of organizing itself that have stickiness and legitimacy over time that could be redirected in ways that, you know, ultimately put a serious roadblock in the path of the accumulation model that we've grown so fond of. So that's where, yeah, to that question, I think it's been very effective at scandalizing heavily at the smallest level, creating memes like the Great Reset, turning them into conspiracy theories coming out of the Heartland Institute, and then at the top level being aware of possible futures in which they see themselves impeded and disempowered, and, you know, acting very quickly to try to get out ahead of those.
Okay, I'll be really quick. I have this feeling that I'm keeping people from beer, which is this really terrible feeling. I'll just say that, like Quinn, I wouldn't never claim to be an expert on UK politics, but we do have Mark Carney in Canada. So there's something similar, I think, to the kind of issue you're raising. And to put it far too simply, but I actually think reasonably accurately, you know, Carney is the Keynesian of our moment.
Mm-hmm.
You know, he's like a less lovable Piketty, but there is an anti-democratic sentiment to this, right? It's a return to and a call for the need for expertise and technocracy at precisely this moment. And in fact, it worked in Canada right now, I think, at least partly because the Trump threat made people listen to that in a way that they would never have done so 6 months ago. And in fact, you probably know, just because of the news, that we were on the road to getting our own little Marshall Poilievre, you know, like Vichy Canada. We were the road we were on prior to the Trump tariffs. So I do think that this moment has a very important spot for them. It might not be one we're glad they filled, the centrists, the Starmers, but I do think it's a really important moment for them. And they're doing the best they can to take advantage of it because they know that it's a very shifting sands, I think, that they're standing on. As for the unity of the left, I mean, I, of course, that would be hilarious if I tried to answer that. I actually know the answer to that. It's 42 or something like that. But it's a crucial question, and it's one that, you know, it's important to raise in every instance like this when we're together and in a generous mood and listening to each other. I don't know the answer, other than to say that I'm increasingly convinced that the sharedness that we share is that we don't know the answer. And that actually, I think, is a more productive and hopeful ground than it might sound like, to come together in the sense that we don't actually know what the future is like, and we don't really know what the answers are. And if we came willing to listen to others' answers, we would soon find ourselves in conversations that we're not in right now. I really believe that. And I don't actually, I would never claim to be an expert on the question that you asked, Darius. Your name? Sorry. You know, Quinn knows much more about that kind of material than me, for sure. But certainly it is the case that climate, at least, became, in the world that I know well, a hammer with which the right could swing its power more effectively, and it just grabbed it. But I do think there were other opportunities, other futures that were possible in those moments. And I wouldn't want to say, because I don't like the language very much, of it's a failure of the left. I'm not down with this constant talk of our failures. We just haven't won yet. You know, that's the way I look at it. But I do think that it was mobilized at a very productive moment for the right, especially in extractive nations like Canada. It was very easy to swing that hammer and to find people who are willing to listen. Anyway, yes.
All right, well, thank you all for being here again, and thank you both so much for sharing your thoughts with us. And thank you all for letting me turn this into a Canada-themed podcast, my long-running goal. There are more beers. Stick around, have fun, mingle, chat in a generous spirit, as our guest said. So thank you all, and big round of applause for Geoff and Quinn. Thank you all.